The agenda this week considered what to do to keep older Ontarians thriving. Talked to political theorist Yasha Monk about the state of Liberal democracy, learned what psychographics can predict about voter choices, heard author Steven Pinker's optimistic take on the state of the world, and discussed his case for the March of Progress. The agenda's Week in Review begins with a look at the gentrification debate in the city of Hamilton. I think the first time you were on this program, Laura, you described Hamilton as a reasonable place to live. Is it still?
No, absolutely not. At the time, I actually recall that. I was paying about $525 a month for my shelter. And now it's about double that. And that's only 6 years. So there's been a shocking rise in shelter costs in the city.
How come?
Well, part of it is this wonderful renewal of the core. I live right downtown. And the other part is we are seeing more transplants from Toronto. It's getting totally unaffordable for them. They're coming to where the market was lower. And it's being eaten up. The other problem is vacancy rates. When vacancy rates get very low, what we see is rental rates go really high. It's just supply and demand.
Gotcha. Try Hamilton is your group.
Yes.
What's your mission?
So Try Hamilton was born out of the desire to showcase neighborhoods. And originally, the intent was for it to be a real estate crawl, but I wanted it to be more than that because of my affliction for Hamilton. So as opposed to making...
Sorry, did you say affliction for Hamilton?
Or love for it, sorry, affection.
You mean affection?
Yes,
yeah, okay.
yes. Thank you, thank you.
We should clarify that off the top there, okay.
But so what I wanted to demonstrate in these neighborhoods, Barton and Kenilworth being the first of which we explored, was that there was also this community base there. So the investment piece that we put together was one that showcased the investment on a financial and emotional and a physical level. So we have a holistic approach when we do our events. The idea is to demonstrate the community that exists and then show people the opportunities as far as where the gaps are and how they can insert themselves within that established community.
Okay. What's your concern on this issue?
Well, I think the concern is that we continue to use this word gentrification, frequently used, very rarely understood. And I think Richard touched on some of the preconditions that started probably in the 80s. So we had NAFTA, the wholesale sell-off of our industrial legacy industries in the North End, which caused, I think, middle-class flight from inner cities, the rush for middle-class families to go to suburbs. Then we had redlining of our neighborhoods.
What does that mean?
It means that mortgage companies and banks refuse to provide capital to local economies to allow local businesses to invest in their own neighborhoods. And then we had what many of us feel is a policy of social containment, where in the very place that Krista was talking about, the Barton-Kenilworth area, there was seemed to be this policy of containment of social pressure, drug trade, sex trade, and then I'm going to say artificially suppressed values of housing. Fast forward to now, I believe that the folks that are moving to Toronto are moving because of a system that has priced them out of their own neighborhoods.
So you mean moving from Toronto?
Correct, moving out of Toronto,
to Hamilton.
It's, they are a effect of a cause, and that cause is the commodification of housing. So when we allow markets to determine where people live and what is affordable, we are going to have this ecosystem that shifts people to other cities because they are increasingly caught with higher costs of living, and they have to move to Hamilton.
Let me throw the other side of the argument out there, though, for argument's sake, which is, I mean, the neighborhood that you have described, the Barton-Kenilworth area, that's the sort of the older east end of the city, some of which is fairly run down, some of which has been abandoned. If people want to come in and, okay, this word is very pejorative again, but let's try it, and gentrify or renew or bring back to life buildings which had been empty or left derelict, therefore are providing no revenue to the city, what's wrong with that?
Well, you raise a great point. There is a process of what I call vulture capitalism, where people will come into communities and they will speculate and they will continue to leave buildings empty, unused. And quite frankly, the municipalities participate in this process because the only way that we can draw revenues into municipalities is for what we call economic uplift. And that is the forced appreciation of prices to allow for MPAC to then put a higher tax assessment to allow more revenues to the municipalities. The challenge that we have is that some of these businesses that are coming into our communities, they don't necessarily serve our communities. And for some folks, it might be distasteful that there's a restaurant that opens up where a meal might cost what they budget for a week in food.
The first thing is we know that social isolation does matter and it can affect a person's well-being because, in great studies of longevity, people who are actually well-connected socially, that means having at least one meaningful social contact a week, and more than a phone call usually, but sometimes for people that's all they get. It can actually lengthen your life by a few years. So there's good evidence behind it. We also know that as people get older, they might outlive friends and family members, and therefore, or if they're a successful parent, for example, their children might be in different parts of the world or whatever the case is. So there's different reasons why people will be isolated. The key is what we know is it's important to help support people to continue to build and strengthen their social networks as they age. So one of the things that doesn't get a lot of press in Ontario, but I've been really thrilled that through our Ministry of Seniors, is we've actually been putting more funding towards bringing people together in group settings, through clubs, through funding more what we call seniors active living centers, because by giving people natural ways in which they can actually make friends, not through clinical means, but actually through social means, just like you did when you were younger, we know that that actually helps strengthen social networks and actually, from a business sense, will save us all as taxpayers more money if they're not using more expensive healthcare services.
What would you add to that list?
I'd like to see, like you suggested, more normalized kind of supports rather than medical. So I like that idea of in seniors buildings or older adult buildings, why not have recreationists that go there and do programming, go for walks, keep people physically active. I'm a big proponent. I was in California, and they provide their support groups, and their groups are walking groups. They go for a walk, and you do your support group as you're doing activity, because it's the isolation. Part of the problem is that the less you do, the less you do. And so you're isolated, and before you know it, you can't get together with your friend because you're sitting in front of the TV, your muscles are not working, you have more pain, you become incontinent. Now I don't want to go out because I'm incontinent. And so we need to get people, it's not just the
physical,
social.
the emotional, the mental,
exactly.
the intellectual
so
all together.
Why don't we have, like every day you're building at 8 in the morning, meet in the lobby, go for a walk. I mean, we have a big issue around the legalities in North America, which I have a big problem with. Like, you need a doctor's permission to go for a walk. Like,
you do. You really don't.
No.
And this is part of the problem, though, is that we do have all these things where, like, I go into places where I do see people told, you can't do this, the doctor says you can't do that. And I said, the doctor can't tell you any of those things, and you,
What are you saying, don't listen to your doctor?
Well, I'm not saying that, but there's all sorts of things that are put into care plans, and you can't have a drink, or you can't do this for, there's no legal authority. If you want to do those things and you're 85, you can do those things. And those may be social things, you got to weigh your own risks and balances. But I was going to say, one of the things is that we have to get the population that aren't in the senior centers, right? It's those people whose spouses died, the kids have gone away, they're living in either, an urban or a rural area where they don't have a senior center, and they're not going to church anymore, or they're not doing to clubs anymore. And how do we reach those people? And I think we really have to do an outreach for that population.
I agree with you, Jane. Some of the things that we've found quite successful in our practice, because a lot of our families, the children may be overseas, they're not at home, they're worried about their parent, they're on the farm. If you look at multi-generational opportunities, so I come from a farming community, the 4-H club, they still exist, believe it or not. If you take the kids at the 4-H club and you start to build the village mentality that we used to have, the kids love meeting those seniors. They love to go and check on Mr. So-and-so because he tells them stories. And pretty soon you have an opportunity. Another thing that we see in some of the the urban communities are some of the church communities are now reaching out, and the synagogues are reaching out to people, and they don't care what your denomination is. It's just part of their outreach, and they're bringing their children and they're teaching them this is what neighborhood is. This is what a village is. We have to, and it's nothing to do with government funding or medicine or healthcare, nothing to do with that at all. I think we have to get back to the village and the neighborhood.
It takes a village. One of the most distressing things I have noticed in the last 5 years, I guess in particular, and you see this in public opinion polling, millennials no longer seem to be as committed to living in a democracy as certainly I was at their age. Why?
So this is some of the things that I show in this book, that in the United States, for example, over 2/3 of people born in the 1930s and 1940s say it is absolutely essential to me to live in a democracy. Among millennials born since 1980, less than 1/3 do.
Less than 1/3 say it's essential to live in a democracy.
And there's also a growing openness to authoritarian alternatives to democracy. So again, quoting the states, but there's lots of other examples. Some 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans said that army rule, pretty stark, straightforward alternative to democracy, was a good system of government. Now 1 in 6 say that. And among young and affluent Americans, it's actually gone from 6 to 35%, a nearly 6-fold increase. So why? Well, I think there's a few reasons. There's some things that are specific about young people. I think they haven't experienced the threat of fascism or the threat of communism. So they may not see, they're very aware of some of the shortcomings of our political system, and they're not very aware of the shortcomings of other political systems and how much worse they are. I think partially we haven't done enough, frankly, for young people to benefit economically. So many of our public policies are skewed towards older generations, making sure that pensions are safe, but not doing very much to actually help young people get trained and educated and so on.
It's so not the case in Canada, I have to tell you. I mean, federal and provincial governments in this country are chasing the millennial vote. I mean, you want to start with legalizing marijuana, you want to start with free education for, eligible post-secondary students.
What about housing policy? Do you have policies here that mean that if you bought a house very cheaply in Toronto or a big apartment in the 70s or 80s, you do everything to make sure that that remains nice and expensive and you can eventually sell it and have a good retirement? But if you are 25 years old in Toronto today and you actually have a decent job, you probably have trouble paying rent?
Well, if you're 25 and have a decent job in Toronto, you can't buy a home in Toronto. That's about it. Probably in most big cities in this country.
And so that's one of the big ways in which young people are saying, you know what, I'm not going to have a better life than my parents did. Even if I have a good job, even if I have a decent career, I'm not going to reach the standard of living that my parents did. And that's a unique development, right? So if you want to zoom out, because this is not just about the young, it's among all age group that you see a disenchantment of democracy. It's particularly strong among some young people, but it exists among all age groups. Look, from 1945 to 1960, the living standard of the average US American doubled.
And again, from 60 to 85.
It doubled. And since then, it's essentially been flat. It's essentially been stagnant. Right? And in other countries, not as extreme. Right? Canada has, frankly, more sensible and fair economic policies, and those ensure that a larger share of economic gains do go to average citizens. But here, too, think about the transformation of the life of an average Canadian from 1950 to 1980. Mm-hmm. It probably went from, perhaps having a car or not having a car to having 2 cars in your household. From a small apartment that may have been sort of coal-fired in order to heat, it was really back-breaking work, to having nice central heating, right? It is all of those kinds of huge transformations that you saw in those decades.
On one salary.
On one salary. Mm-hmm. Now you have 2 people working and being stressed, and probably being a little better off than they were a few decades ago, but not much. Mm-hmm. And so that makes a real transformation, where people used to say, hey, do I really love politicians in Ottawa? Do I think that they're paragons of moral virtue? I don't think people ever thought that. But they said, you know what? They seem to be sticking to their end of the deal. In the end, they're doing something for me. So let's give them the benefit of a doubt. Now people are starting to say, I don't know that I trust them. They haven't really done much for me. So let's try something new. Perhaps let's try a new Premier of Ontario.
When you're trying to micro-target any individual, your margin of error is going to be very high. you probably didn't know what you were going to be doing today, Steve. Chaos ensues. Things happen to you in an unexpected way in your day. Trying to target an individual, that's what fortune tellers do. Actuaries look at populations of people. So the first thing you need to do is you need the psychographics to come from the ground up. What Cambridge Analytica did is they set these profiles up ahead of time and said some people are open, some people are agreeable, some people are extroverted. It's called the ocean demographics. It's been used for quite a while, actually. You see them up in advertising firms everywhere you go. And they tried to pigeonhole people into one of these 5 categories and say, well, if you're an extroverted person, you're probably going to vote for Hillary Clinton. No, it's a lot more complicated than that. So as a company that has done this and works in prescriptive analytics, and that's what it's called when you influence things, it's called prescriptive, it's much more complicated than categorizing people into one of 5 categories. Because guess what? Some days you're more neurotic than others. I mean, when you're sitting and doing a media interview, you might be feeling more neurotic today than you are tomorrow when you're sitting in front of your TV, drinking a coffee and watching the morning news. So people's personalities change throughout the day, throughout the month. So trying to pigeonhole people and saying this is how they're feeling today, therefore they're going to vote for Clinton or Trump, that's the thing I take issue with. I don't think they did it the way they described they did it. I don't see that working in any very effective way.
I want to tap into your experience and knowledge here on a study that you were involved with, trying to affect choice using psychographic information. You know the study I'm talking about? Maybe help us out with this.
Well, so this is a study that we published in 2012, and it was basically a prototype version of this type of message tailoring based on personality profiles of the recipient audience. So we started out with a smartphone advertisement, a generic smartphone. We made 5 different versions of this advertisement. We had one for each of the 5 major dimensions of personality in the ocean model, as Erin was just describing. So there's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. This is the structure of personality. So this isn't simply something that advertisers have come up with. This is personality psychologists over decades have developed this scientific framework. It is actually currently the best framework we have right now for understanding how people are different from one another. Trying to map what someone is like, we need to use the ocean model. That's what the scientific literature actually uses. In this particular study, we built on that, and we actually tailored the content of the advertisements to hit on the key motivational properties of each trait dimension. So extroversion, for instance, we know is associated with reward sensitivity and the desire for social attention. So in the advertisement copy, we had the same image, the same text at the top, but then keywords inserted to be relevant to that particular trait dimension. So do you want to have the attention you deserve in life? Do you want the status and power you've always been wanting? That targets an extroverted personality. Someone who is low on extroversion is just not going to resonate with those particular
You wouldn't use that
types.
copy. You do something else in that case.
You do something else. So we had 5 different versions of this advertisement, and we found that people were much more receptive to the advertisements when it was congruent with their own personality profile.
That suggests to me, Erin, that if you applied those same principles to a political campaign, you would be far more persuasive than just running, as Alexander Nick said off the top, than running some generic ad designed to hit 100 million people, but which didn't necessarily hit you where you live. Is that fair to say?
Nobody is using generic ads that I know of on social media or in any targeted advertising way. It's always targeted. Now, some people will use the ocean prototype. Others, like us, do a much more personalized ground-up thing. And yes, like I said, prescriptive analytics, it does work. There's much more sophisticated tools now that we can use now with artificial intelligence than bucketing everybody into one of 5 categories. We have tons and tons of categories, like I mentioned, when we do our tourism stuff, much more precise, and we feel much more effective. But it's also important to understand that even with whatever psychographics you're using, whether it's ocean or others, you're not getting people to do things they would not otherwise want to do. So what you're doing is you're saying, you're extroverted, I'm going to give you an ad that is tailored to extroverted people because that is what you are. When it comes to getting people to do things, for instance, when you see targeted ads in advertising, you're seeing skis because they know you're shopping for skis. They're not going to show you skis if you are a person who lives in the desert and doesn't like skiing. So it's also important to understand that what these ads are doing is trying to get the message to the people who are going to be receptive to them.
much of the authoritarian populist backlash that we've seen in the United States and in Eastern Europe comes from denying the ideals of the Enlightenment. For one thing, hope for a better progress, for a better future, that is progress, as opposed to looking back to a golden age and making America or any other country great again. That is trying to lurch the country backward instead of solving the problems that remain and hoping for a better future. The idea that all of humanity ought to be the subject of our moral concern as opposed to the greatness of our own tribe or nation. The idea that science is the way that we determine the truth about how the world works, that all of our hypotheses are tentative and provisional, and we let reality tell them which ones are true or false, as opposed to dividing into tribes and declaring that our own policies are the best, and rather than subjecting them to test. So ideal after ideal is being challenged by this authoritarian populist backlash. And the thing is that the people who ought to be defending the institutions of the Enlightenment have kind of unilaterally disarmed.
How come?
They kind of agreed, well, yes, society is a cesspool of pollution and inequality and racism and terrorism. And so just the very people who ought to be saying the institutions of liberal democracy and science have not created a perfect world. There will never be a perfect world, but they've made a better world. And people aren't stepping forward to defend them.
They seem unusually unwilling not to go to bat for the progress that has been made so far. Do you know why that is?
Well, I do speculate. I have a chapter called Progressophobia on the fact that intellectuals hate progress. Even intellectuals who call themselves progressive hate progress.
Actually, your quote is, can I say? Yes. Intellectuals hate progress. Intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress.
Yes.
That's what you say.
That's what I say. Part of it is that we are all subject to a cognitive illusion upon reading the news, that when since the news highlights what goes wrong wherever it goes wrong, and things will always go wrong. There's just never going to be a perfect world.
It's the nature of humanity.
It's the nature of the universe.
Right.
The second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy. There's so many more ways for things to go wrong than to go right, then naturally things are going to go wrong an awful lot of the time, and we have to deploy knowledge and energy to carve out the kind of order that allows us to thrive. But it's always fraying, falling apart, corroding, and we constantly have to maintain it. So if you're not aware of that, if you see any deviation from a perfectly affluent, egalitarian, cooperative society as some kind of cosmic outrage, how can it be that society isn't working perfectly? Who are the villains that we should blame for that? Then you're going to misperceive the way things work, which is that left to its own devices, things don't work, things fall apart, food doesn't leap onto our plates, wealth doesn't come into existence, human nature means that people will come into conflict. What we've achieved through the institutions inspired by the Enlightenment, like democracy, like science, like markets, is we found ways of creating wealth, of getting along as well as humans can ever get along. Let's try to iron out the remaining bugs as they pop up, and appreciate what's gotten us to this point. Now, it's often not the way many intellectuals think, partly because of, I think, the cognitive illusion delivered by the news, but also because society has a number of different professional guilds. There's the journalists, there's the academics, there's the religious establishment, the military, the politicians, the business people. They're all kind of jockeying for prestige and the moral high ground. And to criticize society is a backhanded way of putting down your professional rivals. So it's a way for academics to put down business people and business people to put down politicians. And so there is always it's always tempting to say society is corrupt and decadent and going down the drain as a way of asserting your own moral superiority.
Janice, to you first. These are the facts on progress. Why are so many people disinclined to believe them?
Because facts don't speak for themselves, Steve, so let me start there. There's overwhelming evidence, and here there is a different set of facts. There's overwhelming evidence that people read and understand facts from where they're sitting. So are they better off? Are their children likely to be better off? And people make relative judgments. In other words, it's not absolute, so these facts are not going to be very helpful to them. They want to know, and they compare within their own historical memory. And many parents today will tell you that they think their kids will have a tougher time than they will in North America.
Let me put that to Greg. Greg, stats are one thing, but my own experience is another thing. Do you understand the distinction of why people may not want to believe that they're better than they really are?
Well, of course, in my book, It's Better Than It Looks, I call this collapse anxiety. We all have, not all, but most of us have this unfocused fear that something's going to go wrong that will cause the Western way of life to come crashing down. I don't think it will, but I sure can't prove that. Nobody can be sure that that won't happen. And we, at the second level, as Janice mentioned, we expect income, material standards, et cetera, to continually rise through most of the post-war era. They've almost doubled per generation. I think we need to change our expectation in that regard. It's much more, most people in the North America have a good standard of living now. The important thing is to sustain that standard of living for many generations, not to think that we could double the size of our houses or double the power of our cars or any of those things again.
Quam, do you want to push back on this at all?
I think that one of the, best lines that there ever was in a British Parliament was that there's lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yes.
And I think one has to always be careful with statistics. Here's an example. If the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, the average stays the same. But life has significantly changed because the gap between rich and poor is very important for everybody's experience of life. So you have to be sort of slightly careful with average statistics, and you have to delve a bit deeper. For instance, when I saw the statistics of life expectancy, yep, they're completely right. Life expectancy has gone up from 29 years to 71 years, but that is mainly due to infant mortality. So, you know, a 29-year-old now and a 50-year-old now and a 50-year-old then will have a difference in life expectancy, but not as much as you think. Because by the time you got to 50, you got a reasonable life expectancy. So you have to be a bit careful with statistics.
Even if infant mortality rates have dropped significantly, I mean, that's progress still, isn't it?
No, we're making progress.
Okay.
But we know that because we're not in caves. So, so we're making progress, right?
And just to chime in on this, because I think the fundamental debate here, Steve, or one of the fundamental debates is, what do we mean by progress? Is it principally material? And almost all the statistics you read have to do with improvement in some way in material standards. Or are we talking about progress in the broad Enlightenment sense of the term, which is the first time really that comes into our vocabulary as moral progress, founded on the human capacity to reason. That's where that concept really comes from. And there, I think, there are grounds for deep pessimism, frankly.
Deep pessimism?
Deep pessimism.
Huh. Quam?
I mean, I think inequality is important. So an example would be, and this is how sometimes things get lost. I come home from work the first day, I've got 2 sweets, I've got 2 boys. Give 1 to one boy, 1 to another boy. Everybody's happy. Come home the second day, I've got 4 sweets. I give 2 to one boy, 2 to the other boy, everybody's happy. Come home the third day, I've got 5 sweets. I give 2 to one boy, 3 to the other boy. Everything goes wrong, right? Nobody's happy.
Right.
Now, in theory, we've got 5 more sweets in the house than we had on the first day, and everybody should be happy, and it should be progress, but like, that's not the world that most people live in.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, April 6, 2018. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety. They're on our website at tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and on our Twitter feed. That's twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.